I was standing in my front yard, watching the sunrise over my 40-acre farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, when I saw the white Mercedes SUV creeping up my long gravel driveway like a predator stalking prey. The vehicle stopped about 50 feet from my house, and out stepped a woman in her late 40s with blonde highlights that looked like they cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit that seemed wildly impractical for a working farm, and her heels sank into the soft earth with each step she took toward me. I wiped the sweat from my forehead with my work glove and waited, already knowing this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Are you Marcus Webb?" she asked, her voice sharp and nasal. "That's me," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. "And you are Patricia Thornfield, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." She said it like she was announcing royalty. "I'm here to discuss several violations that have been reported regarding your property." I felt my jaw tighten. When I'd bought this farm 3 years ago, it had been outside any HOA jurisdiction. The land had been in agricultural use for over a century, and the previous owner, Old Man Henderson, had sold it to me for a fair price after his health started failing. The property included a renovated farmhouse, 2 barns, a chicken coop, and acres of land where I grew vegetables and raised livestock. It was everything I'd dreamed of after leaving my corporate job in Philadelphia. "I'm not part of any HOA," I said firmly. "This property predates any subdivision around here." Patricia's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile on someone with actual warmth. "That's where you're mistaken, Mr. Webb. Meadowbrook Estates expanded its boundaries last year, and your property now falls within our jurisdiction. The county approved the annexation in August. Annexation? Nobody told me about any annexation. The notices were sent by certified mail to all affected properties," she said, pulling out a tablet from her designer bag. "According to our records, you were notified 3 times. I never received any certified mail about this." She tapped on her screen with a manicured nail. "Nevertheless, you are now bound by our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I'm here to inform you of multiple violations that need immediate correction." I felt heat rising in my chest, the kind that comes from pure frustration. "What violations?" Patricia began reading from her tablet like a prosecutor delivering charges. "Violation 1, livestock on residential property. Your chickens, goats, and pigs constitute a nuisance and violate Section 12.3 of our bylaws. Violation 2, agricultural equipment visible from the road. Your tractor and farm implements must be stored out of sight. Violation 3, unapproved structures. Your barns were not submitted for architectural review. Violation 4, commercial activity. You're running a farm stand selling produce which violates our prohibition on home-based businesses. Violation 5, vehicle violations. Your pickup truck is considered a commercial vehicle and must be parked in an enclosed garage. Shall I continue?" "This is insane," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "This is a working farm. It's been a farm for over 100 years. You can't just come in here and tell me I can't farm my own land." "The HOA has the authority granted by the county annexation," Patricia replied coolly. "You have 30 days to remedy these violations or face fines of $500 per day per violation. That's $2,500 daily if my math is correct. $500 per violation, that's extortion. That's enforcement, Mr. Webb. Our community has standards. Perhaps you should have considered that before choosing to live in Meadowbrook Estates." "I didn't choose to live in Meadowbrook Estates. I bought a farm in the middle of nowhere, and your HOA apparently decided to swallow up my property without my knowledge or consent." Patricia snapped her tablet cover shut. "You have 30 days. I suggest you consult with an attorney if you have questions about the legality of our actions. Good day, Mr. Webb." She turned on her heel, nearly twisting her ankle in the process, and marched back to her Mercedes. I stood there, watching her drive away, feeling like I'd just been hit by a freight train. My hands were shaking with anger and disbelief. I immediately went inside and started searching through my mail records. I kept everything organized in a filing system because running a farm meant keeping track of expenses, receipts, and documentation for tax purposes. I went through 3 months of records and found absolutely nothing from any HOA or about any annexation. No certified mail slips, no notices, nothing. That afternoon, I drove into downtown Lancaster to visit the county clerk's office. The building was an old stone structure that smelled like old paper and floor wax. I waited in line for 20 minutes before getting to speak with a clerk named Jennifer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "I need information about an HOA annexation that supposedly happened in August," I told her, providing my property address. Jennifer typed on her computer, her fingers clicking rapidly across the keyboard. "Okay, I see it here. Meadowbrook Estates HOA filed for boundary expansion on July 15th. Public notice was published in the Lancaster County Times for 3 consecutive weeks as required. The County Planning Commission held a hearing on August 20th, and the expansion was approved on August 27th. Was I notified personally? Let me check the notification records. More typing. Yes, according to this, certified letters were sent to all affected property owners on July 18th. I never received anything. Do you have proof of delivery? Jennifer's expression shifted to concern. The county doesn't maintain those records. We just confirm that the HOA submitted affidavits stating the notices were sent. You'd need to check with the post office for delivery confirmation. But the HOA could have just said they sent the notices without actually doing it. Technically, yes, though that would be fraudulent. Do you have reason to believe the notices weren't sent? I never received anything, and I check my mail religiously. Jennifer leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Between you and me, you're not the first person to come in here with this complaint about Meadowbrook Estates. 3 other property owners have asked similar questions in the past 6 months. That piece of information hit me like a punch to the gut. What happened to them? I can't discuss other people's cases, but I'd recommend you get a lawyer. Soon. I left the county office feeling sick to my stomach. I spent the next 2 days researching HOA law and making phone calls. What I learned was disturbing. In Pennsylvania, HOAs had broad powers once they established jurisdiction over a property. They could levy fines, place liens, and even foreclose if fees and fines went unpaid. The legal system generally favored HOAs because courts viewed them as voluntary associations managing common property interests. But in my case, there was nothing voluntary about it. I found a lawyer named David Ramirez who specialized in property law. His office was in a renovated brick building near the courthouse. David was in his mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. I explained my situation while he took notes on a legal pad. "This is problematic," he said when I finished. "If the county approved the annexation following proper public notice procedures, challenging it will be difficult and expensive. However, if you never received personal notice, that could be grounds for appeal. What are my options?" First, we file a response contesting the violations and challenging the HOA's jurisdiction over your property. Second, we investigate whether proper notice was actually given. If we can prove you weren't notified, we might be able to get the annexation nullified as it applies to your property. Third, we could argue that the restrictions are unreasonable as applied to a pre-existing agricultural operation. How much is this going to cost? David leaned back in his chair. I'll be honest with you, Marcus, fighting an HOA is expensive. They have deep pockets from membership dues, and they're usually prepared for legal battles. A case like this could run anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000, and that's if it doesn't go to trial. I felt my heart sink. I don't have that kind of money. Everything I have is tied up in the farm. I understand. Let me draft an initial response letter and do some preliminary investigation. We'll charge you $2,000 for that, and then we can reassess based on what we find." I agreed, even though $2,000 was money I didn't really have to spare. I left David's office feeling overwhelmed and returned to the farm to do the evening chores. My animals needed feeding regardless of whatever legal nightmare I was facing. 3 weeks passed, and David sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA challenging their jurisdiction and demanding proof that I'd been properly notified. The response came not from Patricia, but from a law firm in Harrisburg called Blackwell & Associates. Their letter was 10 pages of legal jargon that basically said the HOA's actions were completely proper, and I needed to comply immediately or face escalating consequences. The 30-day deadline came and went. I didn't comply with any of the demands because doing so would have essentially destroyed my farm. You can't run a farm without livestock, equipment, or barns. The day after the deadline, I received another certified letter, this time listing fines that had begun accruing. $2,500 per day, exactly as Patricia had promised. I called David immediately. "They're fining me $2,500 a day. That's $17,500 a week. I'll lose everything in a month." "Don't panic yet," David said. "We're filing for an emergency injunction to halt the fines while we litigate the underlying jurisdictional issues. I'm also working on getting the Postal Service delivery records. If we can prove you never received notice, this whole thing could collapse." The injunction hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, the fines continued to accumulate on paper. According to the HOA's calculations, I now owed over $50,000 in penalties. The number was so absurd it almost seemed meaningless, except that I knew HOAs had the power to place liens and foreclose on properties to collect unpaid fines and fees. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of my farm through the open window. The distant bleating of goats, the rustle of leaves in the oak trees that lined the property, the creak of the old barn settling. I'd worked so hard to build this life, and now it felt like it was all slipping away because of some power-hungry HOA president and her absurd rules. The hearing was held in a courtroom that smelled like lemon furniture polish and tension. David presented our arguments clearly and professionally, emphasizing that I'd never received notice of the annexation, and that the restrictions were unreasonably applied to a pre-existing agricultural operation. The HOA's lawyer, a severe man in his 50s named Gregory Blackwell, countered with the county's approval documents and affidavits stating that notice had been properly sent. Judge Martha Kowalski, a gray-haired woman with a stern expression, listened to both sides before delivering her ruling. While the court is sympathetic to Mr. Webb's situation, the evidence shows that the county followed proper public notice procedures in approving the annexation. The HOA has submitted affidavits stating that individual notice was sent to all affected properties. Without concrete evidence that notice was not sent or was improperly sent, this court cannot invalidate the annexation. However, I am troubled by the severity of the fines being imposed. I'm ordering a temporary reduction of the daily fines to $500 total, not per violation, while the underlying issues are resolved. Motion for injunction is denied. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. David put a hand on my shoulder as the judge left the courtroom. "We're not done yet," he said. "I'm still working on the postal records, but the Postal Service was a bureaucratic nightmare. Despite multiple requests and FOIA filings, we couldn't get clear records proving that certified mail had or hadn't been delivered to my address during the relevant time period. The post office's position was that if delivery confirmation wasn't specifically tracked, they didn't maintain records beyond 90 days. Meanwhile, the fines continued to mount. $500 a day meant $3,500 a week, $15,000 a month. By December, according to the HOA's accounting, I owed over $90,000 in fines, plus their legal fees which they were adding to my bill. I tried to keep the farm running normally, but the stress was crushing. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning with anxiety attacks, my heart pounding and my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. My neighbor, an elderly man named Pete Bradshaw who'd lived in the area for 40 years, would come by sometimes to help with chores and offer moral support. "This is wrong, Marcus," Pete would say, shaking his head. "That HOA is like a cancer, spreading into areas where it doesn't belong. They did the same thing to the Thompson property last year. Family owned that land for 3 generations, and the HOA forced them out over some nonsense about their barn being an eyesore. What happened to the Thompsons? They sold. Couldn't afford to fight anymore. Some developer bought the property and now they're putting up those cookie-cutter townhouses. That's what this is really about, you know. Your land is valuable. Prime location, good acreage. The HOA wants to force you out so their developer friends can cash in." I hadn't considered that angle, but it made sickening sense. My 40 acres were probably worth close to $1 million to a developer. As a working farm, it generated maybe $60,000 a year in revenue, barely enough to cover expenses and my modest living costs. But subdivided into lots for McMansions. That was serious money. In January, I received a notice that the HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines and fees totaling $137,000. David filed an objection, but the lien was recorded with the county regardless. My farm now had a legal claim against it that exceeded any equity I had in the property. February brought another blow. I received a notice of intent to foreclose. The HOA was claiming I'd defaulted on my obligations under the CC and Articus, and they were initiating foreclosure proceedings to collect on the lien. The notice gave me 30 days to pay the full amount owed or enter into a payment arrangement. I called David in a panic. "They're foreclosing." "How can they foreclose on my farm? It's legal in Pennsylvania," David said grimly. "HOAs have statutory authority to foreclose for unpaid assessments and fines. I knew this was a possibility, but I didn't think they'd move this aggressively. What can I do?" "We can file for bankruptcy protection, which would trigger an automatic stay and halt the foreclosure temporarily. That would give us more time to fight, but it would also damage your credit and complicate matters." "I don't care about my credit. I care about keeping my farm." "Then let's file for Chapter 11. It'll cost another $3,000 in legal fees, but it's your best option right now." I scraped together the money by selling off some of my livestock and equipment, the very things the HOA had complained about in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on me. The bankruptcy filing halted the foreclosure, but it also meant every financial aspect of my life was now under court scrutiny. The bankruptcy trustee assigned to my case was a stern woman named Carol Fitzpatrick. She reviewed my farm's finances with a skeptical eye, clearly doubting whether the operation was viable enough to reorganize under Chapter 11. I presented her with 3 years of tax returns showing that the farm had been profitable, if modestly so, but she was more concerned about the massive debt the HOA had stacked against me. "Mr. Webb, you're showing income of approximately $60,000 annually, but you're facing a debt claim of over $150,000, and it's growing every day because the fines are still accruing," Carol said during our meeting. "How do you propose to pay this?" "The debt isn't legitimate," I argued. "I shouldn't be subject to HOA jurisdiction in the first place. My lawyer is still fighting that." "But legally, as of right now, you are subject to their jurisdiction. A court will need to overturn that before the debt can be discharged. In the meantime, you need a realistic plan to deal with this creditor." I didn't have a realistic plan. Nobody could. There was no way to pay off a debt that increased by $500 every single day while trying to run a farm that barely broke even most months. In March, things took a darker turn. I came home from the farmer's market one Saturday afternoon to find Patricia Thornfield walking around my property with a man in a suit, pointing at various structures and taking photographs. I parked my truck and approached them immediately. "What are you doing on my property?" I demanded. Patricia turned with that same cold smile. "This is Robert Chen, a property assessor. We're conducting an evaluation in preparation for the foreclosure sale." "You can't do that. I filed bankruptcy. There's an automatic stay." "The stay prevents foreclosure proceedings, but it doesn't prevent us from preparing for the eventual sale once the stay is lifted," Patricia said smoothly. "And it will be lifted, Mr. Webb. You can't possibly reorganize this debt." Robert Chen, who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, nodded at me apologetically. "I'm just doing my job, sir, taking measurements and photographs for the listing." "Listing? You're already planning to sell my farm." "When the bankruptcy is dismissed, we'll need to move quickly," Patricia said. "We've already identified several interested buyers. Your property would be perfect for a luxury development. Those barns will need to be demolished, of course, but the main house has good bones." I felt rage building in my chest like a physical pressure. "Get off my property, now." "We have a legal right to inspect collateral securing a debt," Patricia said, but she started walking back toward the driveway anyway. "You'll be hearing from us soon, Mr. Webb." I called David immediately and told him what happened. He confirmed that creditors did have some rights to inspect collateral during bankruptcy proceedings, but Patricia's behavior was aggressive even by HOA standards. "They're really pushing this," David said. "I think your neighbor Pete might be right. This feels less like enforcement and more like a targeted effort to acquire your property." "What can we do?" "I'm going to file a motion to void the lien based on the questionable jurisdiction. If we can get a judge to seriously examine whether you were properly brought into the HOA in the first place, we might have a chance." "But Marcus, I need to be honest with you. This is a long shot. The courts generally defer to HOAs and we're fighting an uphill battle." The hearing on David's motion was scheduled for April 15th. Tax day, appropriately enough. I spent the weeks leading up to it trying to keep the farm operational while dealing with mounting pressure from every direction. The bankruptcy trustee wanted detailed financial records. The HOA kept sending inspection notices and violation updates. My few remaining customers at the farm stand were asking questions about whether I'd still be in business next season. The night before the hearing, Pete came by with a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. We sat on my front porch as the sun set, painting the Pennsylvania sky in shades of orange and purple. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you did everything you could," Pete said, pouring 2 generous measures. "This whole thing is crooked and everybody around here knows it." "Knowing it's crooked and proving it in court are 2 different things," I replied. "True enough, but sometimes the truth comes out in unexpected ways." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I appreciated the sentiment. We sat in comfortable silence, drinking bourbon and watching the stars come out. For a moment, I could almost pretend everything was normal, that I was just a farmer enjoying a quiet evening on his land. The hearing the next day was in a larger courtroom, before a different judge. Judge Robert Harrison was younger than Judge Kowalski, maybe in his early 50s. With sharp features and a reputation for being unpredictable. David presented our arguments methodically, emphasizing the questionable notice procedures, the disproportionate fines, and the evidence suggesting the HOA was motivated by financial gain rather than legitimate community standards. Gregory Blackwell countered with a mountain of paperwork showing the county's approval, the HOA's bylaws, and the standard enforcement procedures. He painted me as a scofflaw who'd been properly notified and simply refused to comply with legitimate rules. Then David called a surprise witness. Pete Bradshaw took the stand, and I realized why he'd made that comment about truth coming out in unexpected ways. "Mr. Bradshaw, how long have you lived in Lancaster County?" David asked. 43 years, Pete replied. "And you're familiar with the Meadowbrook Estates HOA?" Unfortunately, yes. Can you tell the court about your interactions with the HOA? Pete shifted in his seat. About 2 years ago, Patricia Thornfield approached me about selling my property. I own 15 acres adjacent to the Meadowbrook development. She said the HOA wanted to expand and they'd make me a good offer. I told her I wasn't interested. A few months later, I got a notice saying my property had been annexed into the HOA. Gregory Blackwell stood up. Objection, Your Honor, Mr. Bradshaw's property situation is not relevant to this case. It goes to pattern and practice, Your Honor, David argued. It demonstrates that the HOA has systematically annexed properties to force sales. Judge Harrison thought for a moment. I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Bradshaw, Pete nodded. Like I was saying, they claimed they'd annexed my property. Started sending me violation notices for every little thing. My shed was too close to the property line, my grass was too long, my truck was an eyesore. Fines started piling up. But here's the thing, I kept every piece of mail I got from the post office during the time they claimed they sent me notice of the annexation. They said they sent certified letters in July. I got no certified letters in July. None. Did you fight the annexation? I couldn't afford a lawyer. I'm retired, living on Social Security. But I did go to the county clerk's office and made a complaint. They told me the same thing they probably told Marcus, that the HOA had submitted affidavits saying notice was sent. But I never got any notice, and I can prove it because I saved everything. What happened with your case? Eventually, I agreed to sell 10 acres to the HOA for way less than market value just to get them off my back. But I kept 5 acres with my house, and I made them agree in writing that those 5 acres would be exempt from HOA jurisdiction. Cost me a lot of money and a lot of my land, but at least I still have a home. David introduced Pete's mail records into evidence, showing a conspicuous absence of any certified mail during the notice period. It wasn't definitive proof that notice wasn't sent, but it was circumstantial evidence supporting our theory. The hearing lasted 3 hours. At the end, Judge Harrison looked exhausted and irritated. This court is troubled by what it's heard today. The pattern of annexation followed by aggressive enforcement and forced sales suggests something more than simple covenant enforcement. However, this court's jurisdiction is limited to the specific bankruptcy matter before it. I'm going to order a stay of all foreclosure proceedings for 90 days while I refer this matter to the County District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential fraud. In the meantime, the daily fines are suspended. We'll reconvene in 90 days to assess the situation. I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly collapsed. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a reprieve. David shook my hand firmly as we left the courtroom. That went better than I expected, he said. Getting the DA involved changes everything. The district attorney's office assigned an assistant DA named Jennifer Martinez to investigate. She was in her early 30s, ambitious and sharp, with a no-nonsense attitude. Over the following weeks, she subpoenaed records from the HOA, the post office, and the county clerk's office. She interviewed me, Pete, and several other property owners who'd been annexed by Meadowbrook Estates. What emerged was a disturbing pattern. Over the past 3 years, the HOA had systematically expanded its boundaries to encompass 7 properties that had previously been outside its jurisdiction. In every case, the property owners claimed they'd never received proper notice. In every case, the owners eventually either sold their property at below-market prices or lost it to foreclosure. In every case, the properties were then purchased by a development company called Crestview Holdings. Jennifer dug deeper into Crestview Holdings and discovered that it was owned by a trust, and the beneficiary of that trust was Patricia Thornfield's husband, Robert Thornfield. Patricia had been using her position as HOA president to identify desirable properties, annex them through questionable procedures, levy crushing fines, and force sales that benefited her husband's company. It was a scheme that had generated millions of dollars in profits over 3 years. In June, the Pennsylvania State Police arrested Patricia Thornfield at her home in the Meadowbrook Estates. The charges included fraud, conspiracy, extortion, and abuse of authority. Gregory Blackwell, the HOA's attorney, was also arrested for his role in facilitating the scheme. Robert Thornfield was charged as well, facing federal charges for wire fraud and racketeering because the scheme had involved interstate communications. The arrests made regional news. I watched on television as Patricia was led out of her house in handcuffs, her face twisted in indignation and anger. It should have felt like victory, but mostly I just felt exhausted. The following week, the county board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to nullify all the annexations Meadowbrook Estates had made over the past 3 years. My property was officially removed from HOA jurisdiction. The lien against my farm was voided and the bankruptcy case was dismissed. I was free. David didn't charge me for the final month of work. "Consider it my contribution to justice," he said with a rare smile. "Besides, this case is going to get me more business than I can handle." Every property owner who's ever had HOA problems is calling my office. The criminal cases against Patricia, Gregory, and Robert moved forward through the summer. In August, facing overwhelming evidence, all 3 accepted plea deals. Patricia was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2 million in restitution to the victims of her scheme. Gregory received 3 years and was disbarred. Robert got 6 years and forfeited all properties Crestview Holdings had acquired through the fraudulent annexations. The restitution meant that all the property owners who'd been forced to sell received compensation. Pete got a check for $150,000, representing the difference between what he'd been forced to accept and the fair market value of his 10 acres. The 3 families who'd lost their properties to foreclosure got their homes back plus damages. For me, the restitution was less about money and more about validation. I received $50,000 covering my legal fees, lost income, and emotional distress. But more importantly, I had my farm back free and clear, with no liens, no HOA, and no threat hanging over my head. I used some of the money to make improvements I'd been putting off. I repaired the roof on the main barn, upgraded the chicken coop, and bought a new tractor to replace the ancient one that had finally given up the ghost. The rest went into a savings account as an emergency fund, because this experience had taught me the value of having resources to fight when your rights are threatened. Pete and I became good friends through the ordeal. He started helping out on the farm regularly, glad to have something productive to do with his retirement. We'd worked together in comfortable silence, 2 men who'd stood up to corruption and won, even if it had nearly broken us in the process. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA went through a complete restructuring. The remaining board members were voted out, and new leadership took over with a mandate to operate transparently and fairly. They reached out to apologize for what had happened, though the apology felt hollow coming from people who hadn't been involved in the scheme but had been part of an organization that enabled it. I declined their invitation to attend a community meeting to discuss healing and moving forward. Some things don't need healing through committee meetings. My healing came from working the land, tending my animals, and watching the seasons change as they always had. One October morning, almost exactly a year after Patricia had first appeared on my driveway, I stood in the same spot watching the sunrise. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and there was a crisp bite to the air that promised winter wasn't far off. My goats were bleating for breakfast, the chickens were clucking in their coop, and somewhere in the distance I could hear Pete's truck rumbling up the driveway for another day of work. I thought about everything that had happened, the stress and fear and anger, but also the unexpected resilience I'd discovered in myself. I'd been pushed to the edge of losing everything I'd worked for, and I'd survived. More than that, I'd helped expose a criminal conspiracy that had harmed multiple families. The farm stand was doing better business than ever. Customers who'd read about the case made a point of buying from me, supporting a local farmer who'd stood up to corruption. I'd hired 2 part-time workers to help with the increased demand, young people from town who wanted to learn about sustainable agriculture. I'd even started dating someone, a woman named Sarah who taught at the local elementary school. She'd approached me at the farmer's market last summer, saying she'd followed my case and admired my persistence. We'd gone for coffee, then dinner, and now she spent most weekends at the farm, claiming she loved the peace and quiet but really just enabling my tendency to work too hard by dragging me away for actual breaks. Life had returned to a new kind of normal, one informed by the knowledge that rights and property aren't as secure as we'd like to believe, that people in positions of authority can abuse that power, but also that the system, however slowly and imperfectly, can sometimes deliver justice. I walked to the barn to start the morning feeding, my boots crunching on the frost-touched grass. The farm was mine, truly mine in a way that felt deeper now than it had before the fight. I defended it, nearly lost it, and won it back. Every acre, every structure, every animal represented not just my livelihood but my refusal to be pushed around by people who thought power gave them the right to take what didn't belong to them. Pete's truck pulled up, and he climbed out with 2 cups of coffee from the diner in town. "Morning, Marcus. Beautiful day." "That it is, Pete, that it is." We stood there for a moment, 2 survivors of the same small-scale war, drinking our coffee and surveying the land that was ours to keep. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA had tried to take everything, had come terrifyingly close to succeeding, but in the end, they'd failed. Patricia Thornfield was in a federal prison in West Virginia. Gregory Blackwell was disbarred and disgraced. Robert Thornfield was serving his sentence in a different facility, his real estate empire dismantled and sold off. And I was here, on my farm, living the life I'd chosen, surrounded by the evidence of honest work and the satisfaction of justice served. Sarah's car appeared on the driveway around 8, and she got out with a basket of fresh-baked muffins. "Thought you 2 might want breakfast," she called out. We gathered on the front porch, the 3 of us, eating muffins and drinking coffee as the morning sun climbed higher in a clear blue sky. This was victory, I realized. Not the legal decisions or the criminal convictions, though those mattered. Victory was sitting on my porch, on my land, with people I cared about, doing work that mattered, living a life that was mine. The HOA had taught me hard lessons about vigilance and the importance of fighting for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. They taught me that corruption can hide behind the mundane bureaucracy of homeowner associations and county regulations. They taught me that sometimes the biggest threats come not from obvious villains, but from ordinary people who convince themselves that their greed is somehow justified. But I taught them something too. I taught them that not everyone gives up, that some people fight back even when fighting seems futile, and that sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and lucky enough and just enough, the truth comes out and justice prevails. The farm would go on. The seasons would turn. The crops would grow and be harvested. The animals would be fed and tended. And I would be here, living the life I'd chosen on land that was mine, free from the toxic interference of people who thought they had the right to take it all away. That was enough. That was everything.